I still remember the first time my son-in-law called me useless. It was almost a decade ago, long before his cruelty became open and unashamed. Back when he still cloaked his contempt in forced politeness, shaking my hand a little too firmly, pretending respect that was never there in his eyes. And it pierced me in a way that I couldn't admit even to myself, because it was spoken in the middle of a family barbecue, surrounded by neighbors, with my daughter's laughter ringing across the yard. And I told myself then that maybe I had misheard, maybe I was too sensitive, maybe the beer had sharpened his tongue. But deep down, I knew the truth. This man had never seen me as anything more than an old piece of furniture that his wife had dragged along from her childhood home. Now, years later, those words, "You're nothing, you own nothing," echo in my head as if they have been waiting, like rust corroding through steel, patient and inevitable, until they finally broke through and forced me to face everything I had tried to ignore. My name is Harold Finch. I am 76 years old, and for most of my life, I was an auto mechanic. The kind of man who spent 12 hours a day bent over engines, covered in grease, saving every dime, paying the mortgage slowly, fixing other people's cars while my own pickup rattled along in pieces. Because customers always came first, and I thought that was noble. I thought sacrifice built families. I thought if I worked hard enough, my wife Margaret and our daughter Karen would always be safe. And that belief carried me through decades of hard labor. Margaret passed away 7 years ago, quietly in her sleep, after 48 years of marriage. And since that morning when I found her lying cold beside me, I have lived in a silence that feels heavier than the weight of any tool I ever carried. You think you know what loneliness is until the one person who witnessed every detail of your life is suddenly gone. And then you learn that loneliness is not an empty house or an empty bed, but the absence of being remembered without asking, of being understood without speaking. And from that day forward I became, in my own daughter's eyes, not a father, not even a man, but simply a reminder of a past she didn't care to keep alive. Karen was my pride once. She was a curious little girl who loved sitting in the garage watching me work, who asked what each wrench did, who could name the parts of a carburetor at 10 years old, who once told me she wanted to build cars with me when she grew up. I thought we shared something unbreakable, that no matter where her life took her, she would always know her father's hands had shaped her world. But when she met Daniel Graham, civil engineer, polished smile, expensive watch, the kind of man who shakes hands like he's taking possession, she began to slip away from me piece by piece, as if he was sanding down every memory we had, until only the ones that benefited him remained. He didn't want a wife who carried the smell of motor oil on her childhood memories. He wanted a woman who believed success meant granite countertops and luxury SUVs, not loyalty or decency. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Karen began to look at me with his eyes. I knew it was happening, but I told myself that all families change, that children grow up and their priorities shift, that maybe I was clinging too hard, and I tried to be gracious. I tried to smile at holidays when Danny made little jokes about antique tools or Harold's Museum of Rusty Bolts. I tried to pretend that it didn't sting when my grandchildren, taught by their parents' example, rolled their eyes when I gave them handmade gifts instead of gadgets. I tried, God help me, I tried. But there comes a point when pretending you don't see the blade pressed against your skin doesn't keep it from cutting you. After Margaret died, the change became brutal. Karen would call less and less, and when she did, it was only to ask if I could help with tuition or a new car or a down payment on the house they wanted in the suburbs. I gave, always gave, because a father convinces himself that money can buy closeness, that if you provide, you'll be loved. But each check I signed seemed to buy me less affection, less respect, until finally I was nothing but a bank account with failing knees. When I visited, they placed me in the smallest chair at the edge of the living room, as if I were an unwelcome guest. And when neighbors came over, Danny would introduce me as Karen's dad. He's retired, just tinkers around, with that smirk that told me he believed tinkering was all I had ever done in my life. And yet, despite every humiliation, despite every withheld invitation, despite watching my daughter turn into a stranger and my son-in-law openly treat me like a burden, I stayed quiet. I told myself silence was dignity. I told myself that if I complained, I'd drive them further away. I told myself that Margaret would want me to keep the peace. But inside me something was hardening, like steel cooling after the fire. Something that remembered every slight, every dismissal, every time I was told to eat bland food at restaurants because Danny insisted red meat wasn't good for an old man. Every time Karen sighed impatiently when I asked about the grandchildren. Every time my offers to help were brushed aside as though I were incompetent. They thought they were erasing me, but all they were doing was engraving themselves deeper into my memory. Now, I spend most mornings in my modest home on the outskirts of Rochester, waking before dawn out of habit, making coffee in the quiet, staring at the garage where my old tools still hang neatly on the wall, their outlines worn into the wood behind them like shadows that can never be erased. My knees ache, my hands tremble, but my mind is sharp, sharper than they realize. They think age is weakness, that wrinkles mean forgetfulness, that silence means surrender. They think they have stripped me of everything. But what they don't know, what they never bothered to imagine, is that a man who spent a lifetime covered in oil and grit can still hide things cleaner men would never suspect. So when Danny finally shouted across the dining table, in front of my daughter, in front of my grandchildren, his voice booming with the arrogance of a man who thought he had already won, "You're nothing, you own nothing," something inside me, something that had been waiting quietly, finally opened its eyes. They had no idea how wrong he was. It was a Sunday evening when everything finally snapped, one of those evenings that should have been ordinary, with the smell of roast chicken still clinging to the air and the sound of cutlery tapping against plates. A family gathered not out of affection, but out of obligation. And as I sat at the end of the table in my daughter's home, feeling already like a stranger intruding in a place where I had once been welcome, I could sense the tension even before the words were spoken, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon, heavy and inevitable. Karen had insisted I come over, had even said in that clipped voice of hers that it was important we all sit down together as a family. And I had forced myself to believe for a few fleeting hours that perhaps she wanted reconciliation. Perhaps she had remembered that I was her father. Perhaps she had finally decided to show me something other than the cold civility that had defined our relationship in the years since her mother died. But the moment I walked in and saw Danny at the head of the table, his jaw clenched, his eyes sharp, and the grandchildren whispering to each other with the kind of half-smiles that children wear when they have absorbed the disdain of their parents, without ever questioning it, I knew I had been summoned not for fellowship, but for judgment. Dinner itself was a performance, with Karen playing the role of dutiful hostess, filling my plate as if she were caring, though her eyes never met mine, and Danny talking loudly about property values, new projects at his engineering firm, the cost of college tuition, all the while throwing in little barbs, subtle at first, about how expensive life had become and how some people should consider what legacy they were really leaving behind. And I sat there chewing each tasteless bite slowly, my hands steady though my heart pounded, because I could feel the noose tightening. I could feel the conversation being steered toward the inevitable confrontation. And then it came, so casually it almost took my breath away, when Karen set down her fork and folded her hands neatly on the table and said, "Dad, we've been talking, and we think it's time you made some decisions about the house." And my throat closed, because I knew what was coming. I had heard variations of this request before, but never with such bluntness, never in front of the grandchildren, never with Danny sitting there like a judge about to deliver a sentence. Danny leaned forward, his voice loud and deliberate, the kind of voice that fills a room because it doesn't care about anyone else's comfort, and said, "Harold, you're living alone in that place, rattling around like a ghost in a museum, and it's not right. You're getting older, you need proper care, and we can't be running back and forth worrying about what happens if you fall or forget to turn off the stove. It's time you thought about moving into assisted living, someplace where professionals can watch out for you and let us handle the property. We can put it to good use." He said it as if he were doing me a favor, as if stripping me of the only home I had left was some kind of act of mercy. And I felt the eyes of my grandchildren on me, waiting to see if I would resist, waiting to see if the old man still had any fire left, or if I would just nod and agree to step quietly into irrelevance. I tried to answer calmly, to remind them that I was still capable, that my mind was sharp, that my house was not just walls and a roof, but the place where their mother had grown up, where every corner held the memory of Margaret's laughter, where the work of my hands had paid for every brick. But Danny cut me off before I could finish, his face flushing red as if my defiance was an insult to his authority. And that was when he slammed his palm against the table, rattling the glasses, and shouted, "You're nothing. You own nothing. You've never owned anything that mattered. Everything you have is because of us, because we tolerated you. You don't get to decide anymore." His words hit me like a blow, and though I had heard versions of his contempt before, never had it been so naked, so vicious, so public, and I felt a silence fall over the table, a silence heavy with satisfaction from him, a silence of complicity from my daughter who sat frozen, and a silence of embarrassment from the grandchildren who glanced down at their plates but did not speak. Karen finally looked at me then, her eyes hard and cold, and said in a voice that was softer than his, but somehow cut even deeper, "Dad, Danny is right. You can't live alone forever. We'll handle everything. We'll take care of the paperwork. It's for the best." For the best. As if the best for me was to sign away the last piece of my life. As if the best was to surrender what little independence I had left. As if the best was to sit quietly in some sterile room while they dismantled everything I had built. I looked at her and searched for some trace of the little girl who used to bring me glasses of lemonade when I worked late in the garage. The little girl who once told me she wanted to build cars with me, but all I saw was the reflection of her husband's ambition staring back at me. And in that moment, as I sat there with the sting of his words ringing in my ears, with the weight of their betrayal pressing against my chest, something shifted inside me. The years of humiliation, the endless giving without gratitude, the loneliness that had hollowed me out since Margaret died. It all condensed into a single sharp point of clarity. They thought they knew everything about me, thought they had stripped me bare until there was nothing left but a frail old man clinging to scraps. But what they had never understood, what they had never even suspected, was that while they were busy treating me like an afterthought, I had been quietly, patiently, deliberately building something of my own, something they could never take away, something that made their arrogance almost laughable. I didn't reveal it then, not yet, because timing matters, and I knew the day would come when their greed would be met not with surrender, but with the one thing they feared most, proof that I was not the helpless figure they had crafted in their minds. That evening, though, as I left their house with Danny's words still echoing behind me, "You're nothing. You own nothing," I felt the keys in my pocket, heavy and familiar. The keys that unlocked not only a set of doors, but the truth of who I still was. And for the first time in years, I smiled to myself in the dark, because I knew the storm they had unleashed would not wash me away, but would instead reveal everything they had tried to bury. The week that followed that Sunday dinner felt like walking through the ruins of my own dignity, each day carrying with it the echo of Danny's words, "You're nothing. You own nothing." And though I tried to move through the motions of my life with the stoicism of an old soldier, rising early, making my coffee, sweeping the porch, checking the garage, I could not escape the sense that something fundamental had shifted, not just in how they treated me, but in how I was seen by the world around me. It was as if Danny's shout had declared a verdict that everyone else had silently agreed to, as if I had been branded with invisibility, and everywhere I went I felt smaller, diminished, as though my own flesh had become transparent. When I walked into the corner store to buy bread, the young cashier who once greeted me politely barely looked up from her phone. When I waved to my neighbor across the street, he raised a hand mechanically and turned away before I could even reach the curb. It wasn't their fault, of course. They hadn't heard the words. But humiliation has a way of seeping into your skin, altering your posture, your voice, your presence, until the world simply reflects back the diminished figure you have become. Karen called me 2 days later, her voice wrapped in false concern, asking if I was eating well, if I was keeping track of my medication, if I had thought about the retirement community she and Danny had toured last summer. She spoke as if I were already gone, as if she were filling out forms for an institution rather than speaking to her father, and every phrase was sharpened with a patronizing softness that made me grit my teeth. "Dad, you know it's not safe for you anymore. You forget things. You seem tired. You can't keep managing the house all by yourself." I wanted to shout back, to remind her that I was the one who had managed that house for 40 years, who had carried it through recessions and sickness and every storm that blew through New York, that I had kept it standing with my own hands. But instead, I listened in silence, because I knew anything I said would be dismissed as confusion or stubbornness. She ended the call with a gentle, "We'll talk about it again soon," as though my agreement were inevitable, as though my will had no weight at all. On Thursday, I went to the bank to update some paperwork, a simple task that should have taken 10 minutes. But as I sat with the young teller, a man barely out of college, I saw his eyes flicker to the screen and then to me with a look that was not neutral, but tinged with something like pity. He asked if my daughter should be present to assist, and when I told him firmly that I was perfectly capable of signing documents, he nodded quickly, but I could see the thought lingering. That was the first moment I realized Karen and Danny had already begun planting seeds, whispering in places I could not hear, shaping a story of a father who was losing his faculties, a father who needed guardianship, a father whose assets had to be protected. That word, protected, always sounds noble on the lips of the greedy. The grandchildren visited on Friday, or rather, they were brought to visit, pushed into it like a chore. They sat on my couch, scrolling through their phones, answering my questions with half shrugs and mumbled words. I asked about school, about their interests, about their friends, but each answer was clipped, rehearsed, a gesture of politeness rather than engagement. At one point, my grandson looked up from his phone and asked, "Grandpa, are you really going to move to one of those places? Mom says you can't take care of yourself anymore." I froze, the words catching in my throat, because I could see how easily lies became truths in the mouths of children, how quickly their image of me was being reshaped by the narrative their parents fed them. I tried to smile, to say I was fine, but they had already lost interest, their eyes back on glowing screens. When they left, Karen hugged me with a stiffness that felt like pity, not love, and Danny didn't even step through the door, choosing instead to honk the horn from the driveway. The humiliation became sharper the following weekend when Karen and Danny insisted I join them for a dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. One of those places where the menus don't list prices and the waiters look at you as if you need permission to breathe. I should have refused, but some part of me, some desperate ember of hope, wanted to believe they were extending an olive branch, that maybe they regretted the harshness of the other night. Instead, it was a showcase of my supposed frailty, a staged performance for the benefit of others. From the moment we arrived, Karen fussed over my clothes, tugging at my sleeve, whispering that my jacket was too worn, my shoes scuffed, as if I were an unruly child who needed to be dressed properly. At the table, Danny ordered for me without asking, telling the waiter, "He can't have steak. It upsets his stomach. Just bring him the fish. Plain, no salt." I opened my mouth to protest, but Karen squeezed my hand with that smile that wasn't a smile at all, and I fell silent, feeling the heat creep up my neck as the waiter glanced at me with thinly veiled disdain. As the evening dragged on, they spoke across me as though I weren't there, discussing mortgages, vacation plans, investments, dropping hints about how difficult it was to balance everything, how expensive life had become, how uncertain the future was. And then Danny leaned back in his chair, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear, and said, "You know, it's a shame when people don't recognize that they've reached the end of their independence. Some people just don't understand when it's time to let go, and they end up making life harder for everyone around them." He looked straight at me as he said it, and I felt the eyes of strangers on me, felt the humiliation spread across my skin like fire. Karen laughed softly, as though it were a harmless observation, but I could see in her eyes that she was gauging my reaction, testing how far they could push me before I broke. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of every small humiliation pressing down, each one heavier because it was not random cruelty, but deliberate, orchestrated, calculated. They were not simply being unkind, they were building a case, constructing a narrative where I was not only irrelevant, but incompetent, where every mistake I made, every hesitation, every moment of silence could be twisted into evidence of decline. They wanted me diminished, wanted me erased, and worst of all, they were doing it with the smug conviction that I would never resist, that I had no fight left in me. But as I lay there in the dark, the keys still heavy in my pocket, I felt something stir, a memory of who I had been before they convinced me I was nothing. A man who had built engines from scrap, who had survived layoffs and recessions, who had carried his family through decades of hardship without complaint. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. But silence, I realized, can also be preparation. And though they thought they were pushing me toward the end, all they were doing was driving me toward the moment when the truth would finally break free. The breaking point came on a gray afternoon when the air smelled of rain and the world seemed suspended between calm and collapse, and I found myself standing once again in my daughter's living room, summoned like a servant to receive instructions about my own life. Karen had called in the morning, her voice unusually firm, telling me to come over because there were documents to discuss. And though I wanted to refuse, to tell her I was finished with these humiliations, I went anyway, because some instinct told me this was not just another small cruelty, but the moment when their plans would be laid bare. The house was immaculate as always, polished surfaces and carefully arranged decorations that screamed of a life curated for appearances, not comfort. And when I stepped inside, I could feel the chill of Danny's presence before I saw him. Sitting at the head of the dining table with a neat stack of papers in front of him, his expression smug in that way only a man convinced of his own superiority can manage. Karen hovered nearby, nervous but determined, and the grandchildren were nowhere in sight, which only reinforced that this meeting was business, not family. Danny gestured to the chair across from him as though he were a lawyer addressing a client, not a son-in-law speaking to the man who had helped raise his wife, and he slid the papers toward me with a smirk. "We've been talking to some people, Harold, and it's clear you can't keep going the way you are. It's not safe, it's not responsible, and frankly, it's not fair to Karen. These are the guardianship forms. We just need your signature, and everything will be simpler. We'll take care of the finances, the house, all the decisions. You'll be free of the burden." His words landed like blows, each one calculated, each one stripped of respect. And I felt my hands tremble, not with weakness, but with rage. Guardianship, such a benign word for theft. They were trying to erase me while I was still breathing, to declare me incapable, to seize control of everything I had built and reduce me to a dependent shadow. I looked at my daughter, hoping for some flicker of hesitation, some sign that she would recoil at the brutality of what was being done. But she avoided my eyes, her face pale, her hands clutching each other in a silent knot of complicity. "It's for the best, Dad," she whispered, her voice so soft I almost missed it. But there was no softness in the reality of her betrayal. In that instant, I understood with perfect clarity that I was utterly alone, that the child I had once held in my arms, the child whose laughter had been my life's joy, now stood on the side of those who would strip me of my dignity for the sake of convenience and greed. I pushed the papers back across the table, my voice low but steady, and said, "I won't sign." Danny's face twisted, his composure cracking, and he leaned forward, his voice rising. "You don't have a choice, old man. You can fight all you want, but everyone can see what you are. You're fading. It's only a matter of time before a judge agrees." He said it with such confidence that for a moment I felt the floor tilt beneath me, as if the entire world had already decided my fate. But then something shifted inside me, something that had been lying dormant under the weight of years of silence and humiliation, and I realized that this was the moment to stop playing the role they had written for me. I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the familiar cold metal, and I drew out a small ring of keys, ordinary to anyone else, but heavy with a truth they could never have imagined. I laid them gently on the table between us, their jingle sharp in the silence, and I looked Danny straight in the eye. "You say I own nothing. You say I am nothing. But these keys say otherwise. These keys open doors to a place you don't know exists, a place I built with my own hands long before you ever sneered at me across this table. A company, a business, land worth more than you can begin to guess. While you were too busy treating me like a burden, I was building something bigger than you could ever take away." For a moment there was only silence, thick and disbelieving, and then Danny laughed, a harsh bark of derision, as if the idea was absurd, as if I were spinning some senile fantasy. But Karen did not laugh. Her face drained of color, her eyes locked on the keys, and I saw the flicker of doubt, the sudden realization that perhaps her father was not the helpless relic she had been convinced he was. She whispered, "Dad, what are you talking about?" And for the first time in years I felt the weight shift, the balance of power tilt, and it was not in their favor. I didn't explain further, not yet, because timing mattered. But I stood slowly, slipping the keys back into my pocket, and I said, "One day soon, you'll understand. Until then, remember this. I am not finished, not by a long shot." I walked out of that house with my head held higher than it had been in years, the rain beginning to fall in heavy drops that soaked through my jacket, but could not touch the fire burning in my chest. They thought they had cornered me, thought they had me beaten, thought the papers on that table would erase me. But instead, I had planted a seed of fear, and fear, I knew, could grow faster than greed. As I drove away, the windshield wipers thudding a steady rhythm, I thought of Margaret, of the nights we had spent in the garage dreaming about what life might still hold for us, and I whispered aloud, "I'm not done, love, not yet." And for the first time since she died, I felt as though she was sitting beside me again, nodding, urging me forward, reminding me that even the old and forgotten can rise when pushed too far. The days that followed my refusal to sign their guardianship papers were strangely quiet on the surface. But beneath that quiet, I could feel the air vibrating with tension, like the stillness before a storm, when the world holds its breath, knowing the thunder is about to break. Karen stopped calling as often, though when she did, her voice was wrapped in a layer of strained sweetness, as though she were reading from a script prepared in advance, carefully avoiding the subject of what had happened in that dining room, yet always circling back to hints about my well-being and safety. Danny, on the other hand, had abandoned all pretense of civility. When I ran into him at the grocery store one evening, his eyes met mine with a kind of contempt that no longer bothered to disguise itself, and though he didn't speak a word, the smirk he gave me was louder than any insult, a silent promise that this battle was not over and that he intended to win it, by whatever means were necessary. It wasn't long before I began to notice subtle shifts in the way people treated me, shifts that could not be explained by coincidence alone. The pharmacist who had always greeted me warmly now asked if I needed help organizing my prescriptions, her voice overly kind, her eyes sharp with a kind of assessing suspicion. The bank teller hesitated before handing me my withdrawal, asking if I was sure about the amount, as though I might have forgotten what I had just requested. Even my doctor, during a routine appointment, looked at me with a certain pitying patience and suggested I should consider bringing my daughter along for future checkups, just in case. The realization struck me cold. Karen and Danny had not simply given up when I refused to sign. They had gone on the offensive, weaving a narrative behind my back, whispering into the ears of anyone who might one day hold influence, creating the image of a man in decline, confused, incompetent, in need of protection. They were building their case brick by brick, hoping that by the time I realized the wall was closing in, it would already be too late. The proof came one evening when I received an envelope in the mail with no return address, only my name typed neatly on the front. Inside were photocopies of medical reports, documents I had never seen before, each stamped and signed, stating that I showed early signs of cognitive decline, that I was incapable of managing financial responsibilities, that guardianship should be strongly considered. My hands shook as I read them, not with fear, but with fury, because I knew these reports were fabrications, lies dressed up in the clothing of authority, manufactured to strip me of the last shred of independence. I could picture Danny sitting smugly across from some unscrupulous doctor, waving cash or favors, securing the signatures that would turn me into a ward of his household. Karen's involvement was more subtle. Her name did not appear, but I could feel her presence in every word. The daughter who once held my hand crossing the street, now silently guiding me toward institutional exile. For a moment, I nearly broke. I sat in my kitchen, the documents spread across the table, and felt the crushing weight of betrayal press against my chest so hard I could barely breathe. The thought that my own child could participate in such deceit made my stomach twist. I poured myself a glass of water, but my hands trembled so badly that half of it spilled across the counter. I whispered aloud to Margaret, as I often did in moments of weakness. What did we do wrong? How did she turn into this? The silence that followed was unbearable, and for the first time I felt the chill of true despair, the sense that no matter what I did, they had already won. But then, like a small flame flickering in the dark, another thought emerged. They would not have gone to such lengths if they weren't afraid. Afraid of what I had hinted at. Afraid of those keys. Afraid that the man they thought they had cornered still had cards left to play. Fear, I realized, was my ally. I decided to test their narrative, to see how far it had spread. At the bank the next day, I deliberately asked to review old account statements, something that would mark me as meticulous rather than forgetful. And when the teller hesitated, I fixed him with a steady gaze and asked him to bring the manager. The manager, who had known me for years, greeted me warmly and handled the request, without hesitation, though I noticed the flicker of confusion in his eyes, as if he had expected to find me doddering rather than clear. At the pharmacy, I asked detailed questions about the side effects of my prescriptions, noting them down in a small notebook, and I saw the pharmacist's expression change from condescension to mild unease. And at the doctor's office, I scheduled an independent cognitive evaluation, insisting on comprehensive testing, leaving no room for speculation. If Danny and Karen wanted to paint me as incompetent, I would counter them not with denial, but with irrefutable evidence. Meanwhile, the humiliations grew sharper, more public. At a family gathering, Karen's idea, she said it would be good for everyone, Danny made a show of guiding me by the elbow into the restaurant, speaking loudly enough for other diners to hear. "Careful now, Harold, watch your step. Don't want you falling again." I had never fallen, not once, but the implication was clear, and I felt the heat of strangers' eyes on me, pitying, dismissive, believing the story because it was easier to accept a caricature than to question it. At the table, Karen corrected me when I mentioned the age of one of my grandchildren, smiling sweetly as she said, "Oh, Dad, you must be confused. He's 15, not 14. She was wrong. He had just turned 14, but the correction landed anyway, reinforcing the narrative of a man who couldn't keep facts straight. When I tried to order a glass of wine, Danny laughed and told the waiter, "Better bring him water. He's not supposed to mix alcohol with his meds," though no such restriction existed. Each small act was a calculated strike, and I realized with a clarity that cut like glass that they weren't just trying to strip me of independence. They were trying to erase me from the memory of everyone who saw me. But what they didn't realize was that every cruelty, every lie, every staged humiliation only sharpened my resolve. They were building a trap, but they had underestimated the man they were trying to cage. I began to prepare in silence, reaching out to an attorney I trusted, explaining the situation in measured detail, handing over the forged medical reports, scheduling the independent evaluations that would prove my competence. I contacted an old colleague, A man who had once worked alongside me in the early days of the garage, who knew about the property and the company I had quietly maintained on the outskirts of town. Together, we reviewed the paperwork, updating documents, securing ownership records, making sure that when the time came, I would not only be able to defend myself, but to strike back with precision. There were nights when doubt nearly crushed me. Nights when I lay awake listening to the creak of the house and wondered if perhaps they were right, if perhaps I truly was nothing more than an old man clinging to fragments of pride. But then I would reach into the drawer of my nightstand, close my fingers around the keys, and feel their weight. A reminder that while they had been scheming, I had been building. That while they had been dismissing me, I had been planning for a future they could not control. Those keys were not just metal. They were the tangible proof that I had foresight, that I had anticipated the day when I might need something beyond sentiment to protect myself. And that day, I realized, had arrived. The escalation was no longer theirs alone. I was escalating too, though not with noise or drama, but with the quiet, deliberate movements of a man who has been underestimated for too long. I withdrew cash in small amounts and placed it in separate accounts, ensuring they could never cut me off from resources. I drafted letters and placed them in sealed envelopes with my attorney, letters that detailed every humiliation, every threat, every attempt to discredit me, so that if anything happened to me, the truth would not vanish. And slowly, very slowly, I began to let the idea of confrontation take shape in my mind. Not the kind of confrontation where I shouted or begged or pleaded, but one where I would simply place the truth in front of them and watch the edifice of their lies crumble under its own weight. The second escalation was theirs in intent, but mine in effect, because while they thought they were tightening the noose, they were in fact giving me the rope I needed to pull myself up. And as I looked out the window one evening, watching the sun set over the garage that still stood solid after all these years, I whispered again to Margaret, "Not yet, love. Not yet. They think I'm finished, but they have no idea how wrong they are." The day of reckoning arrived not with a plan of my choosing, but with one forced upon me, when Karen and Danny summoned me to what they called a family meeting, though it had none of the warmth of family and all the cold calculation of an ambush. They insisted I meet them at their house, and though every instinct told me to refuse, I agreed, because I understood at last that avoidance only fed their arrogance, and the time had come to look them in the eye without flinching. When I walked into their dining room, the same room where Danny had once slammed his hand on the table and declared me nothing, the air was already heavy with expectation. The grandchildren sat on one side, their faces tense with confusion, caught between loyalty to their parents and unease at the cruelty they had witnessed, while Karen stood near the sideboard, her hands folded tightly, her lips pressed thin, and Danny sat in his usual chair, leaning back with a smugness that was almost theatrical, a man who believed the script of victory had already been written. On the table before him lay a neat stack of folders, papers arranged as if for a courtroom, and beside them a glass of whiskey half finished, his confidence distilled into liquid arrogance. He gestured toward the chair opposite him and said, "Sit down, Harold. It's time we put this to rest once and for all." I sat, not because he commanded it, but because I wanted to be exactly where I was when the truth finally shattered their illusions. Karen spoke first, her voice brittle with forced calm, explaining how difficult it had been to watch me decline, how painful it was to see me struggling, how she and Danny had sought professional advice about the best way forward. She spoke of guardianship again, of responsibility, of safety, each word a knife wrapped in silk. And though I could hear the rehearsed cadence of her lies, I also heard the tremor beneath them, the slight shake of a daughter who knew deep down that what she was doing was not born of care, but of betrayal. Danny picked up where she left off, sliding one of the folders across the table toward me. Inside were the forged medical reports, now bolstered by additional statements, each one painting me as a man incapable of managing his life. "The evidence is overwhelming," he said, his voice booming with the satisfaction of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "You can fight it if you want, but the court will see what everyone else already knows. You're not fit to handle your own affairs. Sign these papers, Harold, and let us take care of what's left of your estate. It's the only sensible option." His eyes glittered with triumph, as if he were savoring the moment he believed I would finally break, would finally accept the role of a defeated old man stripped of dignity. I let the silence stretch, watching their confidence swell, watching Karen's shoulders relax slightly, watching even the grandchildren glance at each other as if they believed the matter was settled. Then slowly, deliberately, I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the familiar weight of the key ring. The sound of metal against wood as I set it down on the table was louder than any shout could have been. A sharp, resonant jingle that drew every eye. Danny frowned, irritated, perhaps expecting some pitiful gesture, but Karen's face drained of color, and the grandchildren leaned forward, curious. I rested my hand on the keys and spoke in a voice steadier than it had been in years. "You have called me nothing. You have told me I own nothing. You have tried to erase me with lies and papers. But these keys tell a different story. These keys open doors to something you never imagined I had. A company, a property, a business that has grown in silence while you dismissed me. For years you treated me like a burden, but all the while I was building something you cannot touch, something worth more than the house you covet, more than the accounts you've tried to seize. You wanted proof of my incompetence. Instead, here is proof of your blindness." The room froze. Karen stared at me as though seeing me for the first time, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Danny laughed, but the laughter was hollow, brittle. "A company? A business? You expect us to believe that? You can barely manage yourself." His words were defiant, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering with uncertainty, with the first crack in his certainty. I reached into my other pocket and drew out an envelope, thick with documents I had prepared, notarized, sealed. I slid it across the table to him, my gaze unflinching. "Believe what you will, but there are deeds here. Registration papers, bank statements, appraisals. Land on the edge of the city, purchased decades ago, now worth millions since the highway expansion. A garage rebuilt into a company with employees, clients, contracts. While you were busy trying to strip me of what little you thought I had left, I was safeguarding what truly mattered. Everything you see here is legally mine, protected, and beyond your reach." Karen's hand flew to her mouth, a choked gasp escaping her, and the grandchildren whispered to each other, their eyes wide with shock. Danny's face flushed crimson, his composure cracking like glass under pressure, and he slammed his fist on the table. "You're lying. You're making this up, some fantasy to scare us." I leaned forward, my voice low, but sharp as steel. "No, Danny. You've spent years underestimating me, mocking me, treating me like an empty shell. But today, the mask falls away. You wanted me powerless, and now you see the truth. I have more power than you ever imagined, and you cannot stand it." The silence that followed was thick with their disbelief, their rage, their humiliation. Karen finally whispered, "Dad, why didn't you ever tell us?" Her voice trembled, not with love, but with the horror of realizing how completely she had misjudged me. I looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. Because love should never have depended on what I owned. Because I wanted to believe you cared for me, not for what I might leave behind. And now I see that belief was a mistake. Danny stood abruptly, his chair scraping back, his face twisted with fury. You think this changes anything? You think this makes you more than what you are? You're still just an old man, and we'll find a way to get what's ours. I rose slowly, the keys still in my hand, and met his rage with calm. It's not yours, Danny. None of it ever was. And the more you fight, the more you expose what you truly are. You tried to strip me of dignity with lies, but all you've done is reveal your own greed. Today you lose the one thing you always thought you had over me, control. I turned then, not waiting for their reply, not needing it because the battle had already been won. The documents were real, the company was thriving, and the law was on my side. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the sound of their voices echoing faintly behind me, Karen's sobs, Danny's shouts, the confused murmurs of the grandchildren, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For years I had allowed their contempt to define me, had allowed their dismissal to silence me, but no more. Tonight I had shown them that the man they thought broken still carried fire, that the father they dismissed still had the strength to stand, and that the truth, once revealed, could never again be hidden. The days after the confrontation felt strangely quiet, as if the storm that had raged for years had finally broken and left behind a silence that was not emptiness, but release. For so long, my life had been defined by their voices, by the accusations, the humiliations, the endless reminders that I was nothing. But now those words no longer clung to me, no longer echoed in my head, because I had faced them and revealed the truth. And in that revelation, something fundamental had shifted. Karen called once, her voice raw with tears, begging to talk, asking for forgiveness, promising that things could change. But I listened in silence, and when she finally ran out of words, I told her gently that forgiveness was not mine to give, not in the way she wanted, because forgiveness would mean returning to the life where I was diminished, and that life no longer existed. I told her I hoped one day she would understand what she had lost. But until then, I could not allow myself to be her shadow any more. She hung up weeping, and though my heart ached, I did not call her back. Danny never called. Word reached me through neighbors that there had been trouble at his firm, whispers about his temper, his arrogance, perhaps even his behavior toward me spreading further than he had expected. He had built his world on appearances, on control, and once the cracks began to show, the facade crumbled quickly. I did not rejoice in it, though part of me felt a grim satisfaction, because justice often arrives quietly, not with thunder, but with slow erosion. As for the grandchildren, one of them, the boy who had once rolled his eyes when I gave him tools, came to see me, alone, awkward and uncertain, standing on my porch shifting from foot to foot. He told me he didn't understand everything, but he knew I didn't deserve what had been said. And then he handed me a folded piece of paper, a drawing he had made of a car, simple and childlike, but offered with sincerity. I took it in my hands and felt something break inside me, not in pain, but in relief, because it meant not everything had been lost, that the future might still hold a seed of connection, even if the past was broken. I went back to the garage more often after that, unlocking the heavy doors with the keys that had once been only a secret, but were now my anchor. Inside, the smell of oil and steel and dust wrapped around me like an old coat, familiar and grounding. The men I had trained there greeted me with respect, not pity, looking to me not as a burden, but as a mentor. And for the first time in years I felt the dignity of work return, the dignity of being seen as capable. The land, the company, the property, all of it stood as proof that I had not been erased, that even when they tried to strip me down to nothing, I had remained someone. I drafted a new will with my attorney, simple and clear, leaving everything not to Karen or to Danny, but to the one grandson who had shown me kindness, because inheritance should never be a reward for cruelty. I sealed the documents and felt a peace settle over me, knowing that what I had built would not be squandered by those who had betrayed me. In the evenings, I sat on the porch of the garage, watching the sun sink low over the horizon, the light catching the hood of an old Cadillac I had been restoring, its chrome gleaming like fire. Sometimes I would speak aloud to Margaret, telling her about the day, about the small victories, about the way the world finally seemed to have balanced itself. I did not imagine she answered, but in the quiet I felt her presence, as if she were nodding, approving, reminding me that even in betrayal there can be clarity, even in loss there can be freedom. And as the days passed, I realized that I was no longer afraid of being nothing, because I had faced the worst of their contempt and discovered that who I truly was did not depend on their approval, nor on their recognition, nor on their gratitude. They had shouted that I was nothing, but in the end, I had discovered that nothing was simply the space left behind when lies are stripped away. In that space, I found myself again, not as the man they tried to erase, not as the burden they wanted to discard, but as the man who had lived, worked, built, and endured. And as I leaned back in my chair, the evening breeze carrying the scent of oil and rain, I felt not the emptiness of defeat, but the fullness of survival. And I knew that whatever years remained to me would be lived on my terms, in my own time, free at last from the weight of their betrayal.